Hi, you're listening to Unbuckle Your Fears. I'm Megan Barrow. I'm a lived experience speaker and advisor sharing my story and experiences of agoraphobia, anxiety, panic and phobic disorders, depression, suicide and complex trauma. In this episode, I'll be sharing my thoughts on my lived experiences of anxiety versus panic versus phobic disorders. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land I'm coming from today in Melbourne, Australia. And if you'd like to support my podcast, I'd love you to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform and give me a rating. You can also follow me on Instagram, and you can also check out my website, unbuckleyourfears.com. I'd also just like to add that if any of the content in this podcast brings up any emotions or distress, please reach out to your local support service. In Australia, it's Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636, and they are both available 24/7. Okay, I thought I would do this topic on anxiety versus panic versus phobic disorders and my experiences, because I feel like there is so much content being shared that comes under this massive umbrella of anxiety. And I don't know about you, but if you're on social media and you follow some of these accounts, some of the advice I link to my responses to panic or a panic attack, yet they talk about anxiety, and then I'm like, well, I'm fine with anxiety. I'm not okay when I panic. What do you actually mean? I also find, and I don't know if this is an Australian thing, because I feel like we're a little bit ahead in the mental health awareness campaigns. That may be wrong, but I certainly feel like we've made such headways in the last 10 years, even 5 years, around anxiety. But I'm going to caveat that unfortunately I've gone from stating I have anxiety with no one ever empathizing with that to, in the last 5 to 10 years, every second person says, oh, I have anxiety too, or everyone has anxiety. So it's almost that it's downplayed. So, and even as a quick story, when I had to go into hospital 4 years ago, and I was terrified. I had to go under anesthesia. I'd never had any surgery. It was just a minor surgery, 15 minutes in and out. It was the 3 hours waiting that was an absolute nightmare. And it was during COVID, and I'm not sure if that affected how people were waiting, but it was a nightmare. And when I checked in with the nurse and she sort of gave me my gown and ID bracelet and so forth, she said, oh, are you going to be okay waiting with everyone? And I said, well, I think so, but I have anxiety. And she said, okay. And I was like, she hasn't really understood where I'm at. And I said, I actually have panic disorder. And she completely changed her tune. So from there she was, okay, well, if you find you're not coping, please come up to the waiting desk and we'll help you and we'll sort out a room for you, which is what ended up happening because I was about to run out of there. But it was really interesting that a nurse changed how she was caring for me from anxiety to panic. And I'm finding that I now am more likely, depending on the situation, I now feel the need to say panic disorder rather than anxiety disorder. So I just thought it was really interesting, and I really don't feel like anyone really talks about it. So, and on Instagram a couple of years ago, I think, I did do a post that talked about that anxiety is not the same as panic, and panic is not panic disorder is not the same as having a panic attack. And having a panic attack is not the same as agoraphobia. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. And I do want to state this podcast and everything I do is purely from my lived and living experiences. So that's quite a common word and term in Australia. If it's not in your area of the world, I hope it becomes one. There's a real movement here about people with lived experience. So people who have experienced a health condition, whatever health condition it is, and the skill sets and power they bring to theory, research, clinical studies, storytelling, that PR awareness campaigns, governance, just the whole realm of the health sector in Australia is starting to become more informed by lived experience, and that the forces that be are now understanding that we need to be at the table, because this is my other argument, and you've probably heard me rant a little bit in previous episodes if you've listened, that there's a lot of experts out there in theory and people talking to words, but don't actually bring in a variety of experiences. So my experience is not going to be the same as yours. There will certainly be some parallels, but I simply come from sharing my lived experiences. If it helps you feel less alone, if it brings more awareness to your recovery, if it's someone outside of never having experienced anxiety or mental ill health that it brings a bit of an awareness of what it feels like and is like, then that's what this is all about. So, anxiety versus panic disorder. Let's start there. Anxiety is something I have lived with my entire life, and I have detailed that in my first episode. And I sort of describe now as an 54-year-old woman that clearly I've had anxiety my entire life, and it's almost like it's in my bones, that I now today simply accept that my default, that I have a predisposition to anxiety reactions, that my nervous system is not set up the same as quote unquote a neurotypical person, and my nervous responses and anxious responses are a little bit out of kilt, for better want of a term. Ever since childhood, my earliest memories are being nervous, being shy, being too nervous to talk to people, already believing that I'll do the wrong thing, people will laugh at me, I'll say the wrong thing, I won't be good enough, lying awake at night, overthinking. Now, literally, I remember lying in bed overthinking what had happened in kindergarten. That was my life, that I would just lie awake at night. My parents knew that I had trouble sleeping. I shared a room at one point with my younger sister who would fall asleep on a dime, and I would be the one that just would lay there awake most of the night till I finally would fall asleep. I'd always wake up tired even thinking of that. Every day felt a struggle. Things were tough, but I kind of coped. Now, I didn't cope all the time, but my relationship with anxiety, even when I have high periods of it now, when it fluctuates even in adulthood and what I define as wellness, is that anxiety feels crap. It feels exhausting. You've got the knot in the tummy. I overthink. I will get stressed more easily. I will not cope more often. I'm more frequently sort of in that not coping and sort of feel like I don't have control. Yet, most of the time, I sort of manage the day-to-day. And even as a child, that was my experience, that school was tough and I would take days off here and there, but I'd still do it. I might find an excuse to get out of something that I thought was scary, like PE or drama class, but I would still do it if forced. I would still do the talk that was part of an assignment for English or history because I'd have to, but I would worry and stress myself for weeks, if not the term. So my relationship with anxiety, and I just always thought in my speech for Beyond Blue in Australia, so I go out and share my personal story on behalf of Beyond Blue, and there's a whole heap of other speakers that also do that. But I talk about that I just thought this was part of me. I could see that other people seem to find life a bit easier, at least on the surface. I just thought this was my lot in life. So anxiety is just part of me. It's part of my DNA. It's not something that just happened to me one day. This is my baseline of living. And to be honest, with everything I've been through, I actually manage my anxiety better today in the last 10 years than I have my entire life. So where my relationship with anxiety, let's put anxiety under this huge umbrella, became unsettled and started interfering with my life was when I started to have panic attacks. Now I'm going to do another separate episode on panic attacks versus trauma responses because I actually think now, and it's only in the last 12 months, that I've kind of identified that I was going through trauma responses that would end up as a panic attack. By the by, let's just call them panic attacks for the purpose of this episode topic. But it was when these panic attacks started to happen, and I will also add in here, again, a lot of this is covered in my first episode, but I went to doctors in this period thinking I was having heart attacks, thinking something was wrong, and no one diagnosed me with having a panic attack. Now, panic attacks were not talked about at all. This is in the 1990s. There's no internet, or the just very beginnings of internet. I can't sort of Google things. There was certainly no book in my home on the topic. So I'm having panic attacks. 7 doctors don't diagnose me. So it's one thing for me to start fearing having these things happen to me, but with more stress in my life and clearly more trauma responses, but let's say more and more panic attacks, it started to become a disorder. So I hear some people call it disordered thinking or disordered panic. I don't know. There's sort of semantics going around there, but my relationship with these feelings turned from managing anxiety feelings and the unknown to not managing them. Now that's where I define going into panic disorder. So I just started to second guess having these events or panic attacks, and I just started opting out of doing certain tasks and being independent. So it started with my sister and boyfriend driving me to work because we all work together. And mind you, I need to put in perspective, the drive was literally 5 minutes from my home. So even something as basic as that started to become unmanageable. And things like going out with my boyfriend and our friends and going to gigs at night, being home alone, work became completely unmanageable, but there was also trauma happening. So that's where things very much get conflated. And I do kind of suspect that most people that end up having a breakdown and in agoraphobia probably have got stuff going on in their life. This isn't, I'd hate for people to think that agoraphobia is just the worst of anxiety and that's a natural progression. Yes, it's the worst of anxiety, but it's not a natural progression. Most people experience anxiety, and it's easy to talk about these conditions of mental ill health as suffering. And I've done a lot of work in the space with an organisation, Every Mind, and there's Mind Frame about language, about mental ill health, very well regarded in Australia by all mental health, by the whole mental health sector and journalists and so forth. But it's interesting how my wording has changed a lot, because we shouldn't assume or put this emphasis that people are suffering through anxiety. Yes, it's really tough. But for example, today I kind of call myself better, healthier than I've ever been in my life, but I still have anxiety. I still get up and can feel a knot in the tummy. I still overthink. But these are just elements that I now have learned are part of me, and I just manage them in a way that I actually am quite well. But yes, let's not assume that people with anxiety end up with agoraphobia or even panic disorder. So there's things that happen that in our lives that may exasperate these experiences, and if we have a default of anxiety, maybe we're a little bit more predisposed to them. At least that's kind of what I reflect on as my experience. So it was my relationship with having undiagnosed panic attacks that ended up into panic disorder. And that was also a time where I was going from thinking, oh, this feels awful, or I don't want to do this, to something is wrong. I am not coping. So the symptoms went from nerves in the tummy, overthinking, occasionally the heart racing as stress or something scary was sort of close by, to hyperventilating, to feeling like I would pass out, to chest pains, to a racing heart that wouldn't settle down at all. And anxiety and panic, by definition, with Beyond Blue. So when I do my speech, beyond sharing my lived experience, I share some information on depression and anxiety as defined by Beyond Blue. And anxiety they define as feeling all the symptoms that we know of being anxious when a stress or something you're scared of is about to happen, when these feelings don't subside, when that stressor has passed or there's nothing obvious to be stressed about. And we certainly know, you will know, that panic attacks, fight and flight. So the panic disorder starts happening when you're assuming and you're kind of in that heightened fight and flight all the time. So it's not just incidences of having a panic attack and being fight and flight. It's happening daily, and you're always on the lookout for it. And I should say, I'm being very naughty because I shouldn't be saying you, I mean I, but let's talk as a collective because that's what I do. So my relationship with panic disorder then turned into a phobic disorder. And it's something that my psychiatrist, when I ended up seeing him 2 years into my agoraphobia, my housebound agoraphobia, that his diagnosis in his notes for me was panic and phobic disorder. And I'd never really reflected much on that in my recovery. And often people would, interview me or talk to me as a lived experience speaker and advisor and say, and what were you diagnosed with? And I was like, I don't know that I was ever really diagnosed. But of course I was. I just didn't reflect on it. It wasn't something we really talked about that much. The reality was I was there because I couldn't do anything. I had no functioning abilities because I was paralyzed by fear. So phobic disorders, and we never talked about it. And I'm not going to talk about the theory. You can go off and listen to a whole bunch of podcasts out there on theory. You can Google. there's AI now that will just tell you everything anyway. So my experience and my interpretation of where it goes from panic into phobic disorder is that you have a complete fear of what you're fearing. So for me, and I describe agoraphobia as a fear of fear itself. You think of a phobia, many people have in their head a spider, a snake, heights, enclosed spaces. People avoid that. People are avoiding these things at all costs. They live their lives usually working around it, avoiding it. Now, when it becomes agoraphobia, then your ability to function becomes very difficult because you're fearing everything. You have a fear of fear itself. So a phobic disorder, I would imagine, is when your phobia or your fear interferes with your life and you become irrational in your thinking and relationship with it and you don't function. So I would imagine that for most phobias we think of or that are talked about, you can mostly work around them, as I've said. But sometimes there are phobias that you can't work around, and then I imagine your relationship with it becomes unmanageable, which is what I define as where I went into phobic disorder. So the panic disorder and the phobic disorder, yes, they're kind of similar, but I kind of think as the phobic disorder turned more specifically into agoraphobia is where I just retreated from life and I was just in complete fear of having the fight and flight panic attack. And at the beginning of agoraphobia, I didn't even know what to define these events as. So I hope this episode has been helpful and interesting. I guess I mainly wanted to talk about it because it's something I reflect on a bit, mainly because of this umbrella term of anxiety, and the theory and tips for getting through events are just not fit for purpose. When people talk about just accept your anxiety, yeah, I accept it. I'm quite okay with all the feelings. When it's a panic attack, I find it a lot more difficult to accept the feelings. Because I'm in a freeze response and you just look at the physiology and your brain goes back down to the rudimentary parts of the cortex that means you actually cannot critically think. So to try and pop an anxiety response and acceptance and here's some tips versus when you have agoraphobia and panic disorder and phobic disorder, they are very different. And again, I am always trying to share lived experiences from a perspective of hope and understanding and to set people up for success. And even if that success is that it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster, I'd prefer that than setting you up thinking this is easy and that it's all the same. And here's a simple tip to get you through no matter where you are on the scale of anxiety disorders. Yeah, I don't really agree with that. That's not my lived experience. I hope you found that interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm sure I will talk more about this topic as we go along. But for now, as I like to do, I'd like to leave you with a thought and a reflection and a question for you. In this topic, I've kind of gone back into my old self and thought about, here is where I was in these areas of diagnoses or ill health. And it's easy to sort of wrap ourselves up in a diagnosis or a health condition. And I think with that, when we're really unwell, it's very easy to forget who we are. What are our characteristics? What's our personality, our strengths beyond considering our health condition? So that's what I want you to consider. I want you to consider, who are you beyond your ill health? And if you need help, ask a trusted friend or loved one, family member, whoever your go-to people are, and ask them how they would describe you. Because if nothing else, I will describe you as incredibly strong, that you just are motoring through and you keep pushing through something that's incredibly difficult that most people cannot ever understand. So strong, add that strong, because that's certainly how I describe myself, yet I feel odd describing myself as that. And I tend to say people describe me as strong. I don't see it, but clearly I am. Have a think, reflect on you beyond your health condition, and remember to tap into that often. I'd even suggest writing it down, putting it somewhere that you can always remember. But I don't care what it is, whether it's funny, intelligent, silly, just get back to the core aspects of who you are and remember that in this health condition, all those characteristics are still in you. That is still at the core who you are. And I don't want you to ever forget that. So on that, please do take care of yourself. Again, I hope you found this topic interesting and you're enjoying the episodes. If you do, please give me a rating and subscribe. Check me out on Instagram at Unbuckle Your Fears. I've also added my LinkedIn details in the description, so you can always check me out there and connect. And my cats are going a little bit chaotic because they've decided it's food time, so I better go. So that's that jingling if you can hear in the background. Okay, take care. Until next time. Bye.